A whole society lived on these islands for thousands of years and then vanished. This is Hirta. You can still see the town remains sitting beside the sea. Stone cottages, some old field walls, hillside ruins, but the people have all gone. So, what happened here then? If you look at the United Kingdom on Google Maps and then look at the far northwest, you'll find something strange. Some islands that look like pieces of the mainland just broke off or something. Way out here in the North Atlantic, far away from the mainland, there's the UK's westmost landmass, a tiny group of islands here with the name St Kilda. Even the Outer Hebrides, the closest landmass, are still about 60 kilometres away. Beyond that, there's basically nothing but open Atlantic until you reach Newfoundland in Canada, over 3,000 kilometres away. For some reason, these islands have fascinated me for years. So far away from everything, sitting in the middle of rough Atlantic seas, surrounded by high cliffs. So I always wondered, what even happens out there? Are there any people living there? It turns out that for thousands of years, people did live here. In fact, the community they built here became one of the most isolated societies in Britain and in Europe. But now they're gone. After thousands of years of human life on these islands, the last residents left and the whole community fell apart. St Kilda is now a lost Atlantic society, and its story is absolutely fascinating. Archaeological evidence like pottery shards show us that Hirta has been lived on since the Neolithic age, around 10,000 years ago. Humans at that time were moving around the seas quite a lot, travelling between islands and coastlines, so it wasn't outrageous for people to reach these islands and choose to settle there. Unfortunately, not much is known about the first settlers. There aren't many records from that period and very little survives from their time. But yeah, we do know that people were living here a very, very long time ago. Around the year 1000, we start to see a bit of written history about the islands and the people living there. A religious leader from Iceland went there and wrote about them in 1202 AD. And he called them something like Hirtir, which is thought to come from the Norse word for antlers. And he might have thought they looked a bit jagged, like deer's antlers sticking out of the sea. There seems to be a lot of Norse Viking influence on the island's place names. Some of them are clearly Celtic from Scottish Gaelic, which was the language spoken in this part of Scotland at the time, but names like Borere and Soe seem to be from Norse. This is evidence that the Vikings must have settled there at some point and named some of the landmarks. Around this time, there were a lot more expeditions to the islands, and people started to write about them and the islanders themselves. The population was always really small, never more than 2,000 people on the island, which is not really surprising because it's pretty hard to find food and survive there. A lot of writings really highlight the island's conditions, which were very harsh. No trees or shrubs can grow there because it's really windy and the wind is full of salt water spray, which would just destroy any crops or big plants there. And yet, despite this, the islanders were fully self-standing and self-sufficient for thousands of years. So how did they survive then in such bad conditions? Well, they mostly survived on catching seabirds and eating their eggs and meat. Unsurprisingly, there are so many seabirds there, like gannets, puffins and fulmars. They also did have cows and sheep on the other islands, so they had dairy goods like milk and cheese. They probably ate their meat as well. These sheep they have, or had, are a really primitive kind, the Soe sheep. They're smaller than mainland sheep and they have earlier genetics. It's thought that the first few settlers who went over to the islands thousands of years ago actually brought the sheep with them, which is more evidence that they settled the islands on purpose and knew where they were. I read that they supposedly did have some crops, mainly sparse potato and barley crops grown in the well-drained soils of the village bay, but not many. And they're surrounded by seawater, so why didn't they just fish? Are they stupid? Well, remember when I said there were no trees on the island? They really had no way of making good sturdy boats or good fishing rods unless they made them out of materials like skin or imported wood. And there are really nasty sea storms, except for basically in the summer months, the whole year. So it was probably just too dangerous to fish instead of just, finding birds and bird eggs, which were already really abundant on the islands. They couldn't risk their men drowning in the sea when they could just go and get a much easier food source. So towards the mid-1000s, the world started learning a bit more about the islanders as they started to have a bit more contact with the outside world. Someone around this time wrote that the islanders had this tradition of throwing messages into little waterproof containers, maybe bottles or some kind of skin thing, hoping they would get picked up by passing fishing boats, so they knew that there were other people around them and wanted to talk to them. A few other random things happened to them at this time. The islands were part of Clan MacLeod of Harris, which was a family that had control of the Hebrides and all the nearby islands, so the islanders were paying rents and probably taxes to them. The islands got a bit of a reputation for having loads of livestock and food, so much so that they got raided in the 1600s. The islanders at this point were basically living the same way they always had, eating seabird eggs and preserved meat, sometimes fishing, going to the other islands around them to store things or to catch birds. They stored their food in clites, which were these little buildings made of stone with gaps between the stones so the wind could get in and dry out whatever was inside. They put grass turf on the roofs so the rainwater stayed out, which is a lot like the houses you'll see in the northerly Scottish Isles and the Faroe Islands to the northeast. You can actually still see these clites on Google Maps if you zoom in. There are plenty of them on Hirta. Apparently, they did have something like a religion. They followed some kind of Celtic Druidism, which was like all the pre-Christian pagan religions before Christianity came to the British Isles. But over time, they became Christianized like everywhere else. So, at this point, there was one particular journey to the islands that I read about, and it was Martin Martin's. He went there in the early 1700s. You can read it online, and I'll put a link in the description. They had a really treacherous journey getting there because they got hit by a huge storm. They got lost at sea for 16 hours without seeing any land and navigated by watching where the seabirds went. They were really exhausted, rowing through the waters for hours, really demotivated. But they eventually landed on Borere. They didn't land on Hirta. And they were overwhelmed by the amount of seabirds that were there. They said there were so many that it darkened the sky, and their poo made the sea turn a different colour around them. They also saw two seabirds crash into each other mid-air. One of them died and fell near their boat, so they picked it out of the sea and they ate it. They finally did land on Hirta, and the villagers welcomed them. They seemed really pleased to have visitors. They gave Martin and his groups a total of 16,000 eggs over 3 weeks. He wrote that one bird laid only one egg at a time, so that shows just how many seabirds were there on the islands if they got 16,000 eggs over 3 weeks. He said the villagers were really poor and that they lived in stone houses with straw roofs. But although they lived in isolation, he said they did know about the islands around them. And they even knew about Rockall, which is a tiny rock miles away from St Kilda in the west. Another video about that one soon. He confirmed that they kept sheep and some horses for moving things around, and some cows as well. And he also confirmed that they had some small crops like barley and oats, that they occasionally went fishing but not very often. And he wrote about the clites from earlier. He said they had otters and seals sometimes come to the island, which they also ate. And he definitely noticed that there were no trees or shrubs. He said in his book that he didn't see a single bee on the islands. They went around different islands and sea stacks with the islanders and watched them climbing up and down the really dangerous cliffs. Some of these cliffs are really high, some of the highest in the United Kingdom. And this was mainly to get bird eggs so they could eat. Good climbers were supposedly seen like local heroes, basically. He said the islanders really knew when the waves were too rough to sail on by how white the waves were when they watched them from the land, and they could apparently forecast the weather by just feeling the wind, watching things around them. They told the time by how the sunlight and shadows moved, and they knew when the tide would be low or high. The islanders told him about a small earthquake that happened in 1686, which was at the time around 10 or 15 years ago, and that it seemed like one of the most exciting things that had happened to them in a very long time. Some of the islanders were also blown away that Martin could write. Like, it seemed otherworldly to them that he could write. He said there were about 180 people on the island at that time, and they married when they were quite young, maybe around 13 or 14 years old. He said they were really honest people, charitable to strangers, and generally really happy. He really made a point in his book of saying that they were happier than most people that he'd met, that they weren't very materialistic whatsoever. They didn't seem to be overly ambitious or unhealthily jealous of each other, but they instead just worked together and really loved each other. Martin seemed really inspired by this, but he did mention that they weren't really aware that they were happy in comparison to anyone else. He really wrote in great detail about the islands and his visit, so read the book if you're interested in that. I've kind of tried to summarise it, but there's so much detail that I couldn't include everything. I've put the link in the description for you to look at if you really want to read it. He also mentioned that the islanders had some sports like swimming and diving. They played some rudimentary games with clubs and balls, and they had, basic forms of baseball and cricket. He said the women did weaving and singing, and they even made rhyming poetry. They had a really high rock on the cliffs that men would balance on to try and woo the women that they liked, which was supposedly really dangerous. He said the men there had an informal parliament meeting every morning to discuss work tasks and split up resources between families, and that women had their own separate meeting. And Martin spoke Scottish Gaelic, but he said they had their own dialect of Scottish Gaelic and used quite a lot of Norse words. So, that kind of proves that the Vikings definitely had a presence on the islands long enough to change the language. A few years after Martin visited the islands, another strange story began to unfold. In 1732, a woman called Rachel Chiesley was kidnapped and taken to the islands. So Rachel was a famous Scottish lawyer's wife, and the story goes that she had written letters warning of her husband plotting treason against the London government. His answer to this was quite extreme. He had her abducted and moved between the remote outer Scottish islands. Of course, eventually, she ended up being taken to St Kilda. The men who kidnapped her were really quite horrible to her. They made her stay in one of those clites on Hirta, and she couldn't speak with the islanders because she only spoke English while the islanders spoke Gaelic. Unsurprisingly, she said she hated Hirta, probably less about the place itself and more because she was forced to be there and held captive. Reports say that she basically slept all the time and drank as much whiskey as she possibly could. While she was on the island, she secretly wrote a letter to her lawyer in Edinburgh asking for rescue. He tried. Firstly, he tried to get a legal search warrant and gather men, but Rachel's powerful husband blocked it and stopped him. Eventually, in about 1741, almost a decade after her kidnapping, her lawyer used his own money to gather an armed search party and go there, but it was too late. Someone had probably got wind of his rescue plan and decided to move her again so she couldn't be found. By the time her lawyer's search party got there, she was gone. And unfortunately, she died before she was ever rescued. You might notice that not much effort was put in to get her back. Her kidnapping wasn't exactly a secret back at her hometown, and this was for a few reasons. It was really, really tough to do a rescue expedition. At that time, English speakers wouldn't have had maps of the area. This was actually the best map they had at the time. Also, the locals spoke Scottish Gaelic, so they would need a translator at all times. Back home, Rachel's family and even her own children apparently didn't try to spread the word. Historians think that Rachel really wasn't well liked in her hometown, though. They say it might be because she was a divorced woman at a time when divorced women weren't really respected. Her husband's power might have made it impossible to get past him as well. He supposedly cheated on her quite a lot, which may have been why she even tried to expose him for treason in the first place. It's quite a sad story overall, even if we don't know all the details. So after the Martin and Rachel Chiesley stories, more and more visitors started travelling to the islands and writing about them. Sadly though, this also brought disease to the islands. There was a big outbreak of leprosy in 1684, and then a smallpox outbreak in 1724, and another one in 1727. The islanders lost so many people from the outbreaks that workers had to be brought over from the nearby Isle of Harris just to have enough men to keep things running. Because of this disease, the population waxed and waned a lot. It dropped down to about 50 before springing back to the 100s afterwards. So the St Kildans never got much of a formal education and didn't really have organised religious beliefs, which makes sense when you're living on a remote island and surviving by hunting seabirds and their eggs. You're probably just hunting and then vibing all day. However, through the 1700s and 1800s, Christian missionaries and preachers started travelling to St Kilda to try to convert them to Christianity. Interestingly, the islanders said they really liked having some of these visitors and enjoyed having the priests on the islands. Despite that though, organised religion didn't really take hold. Eventually there were some priests who managed to do it. Unfortunately though, in this century they got a bit of a crazy minister, Jon Mackay. They say that Jon Mackay may have done more than any single individual to destroy the traditional St Kilda way of life. He introduced 3 Sunday church services that lasted 3 hours each, and going there was basically compulsory for the islanders. One visitor wrote in 1875, "The Sabbath was a day of intolerable gloom. At the clink of the bell, the whole flock hurried to church with sorrowful looks and eyes bent upon the ground. It's considered sinful to look to the left or to the right." They spent so much time at church that it basically stopped them from properly running the island. Old ladies and children who made noise in church were given lectures and told they'd be punished in the afterworld. At one point there was a food shortage and a relief vessel carrying food arrived on a Saturday, but Jon Mackay said the islanders had to spend the day preparing for church and the supplies weren't unloaded until the following Monday. Children were forbidden from playing games and had to carry a Bible wherever they went. The St Kildans had to put up with this guy Mackay for 24 years. They did talk of leaving the island forever while he was over there, but it never happened. So at the turn of the 19th century, another big change for the islands was tourism. Travelling there became a bit cheaper and more people were aware of the islands. At first, most of the tourists were basically folklorists and bird enthusiasts who were just interested in the wildlife and the culture. But later on, they got curious people going who just went to see the islanders. And that must have made them feel a bit like monkeys in a zoo exhibit. Tourism brought them some really good things. Ships brought goods over like, tea, sugar, flour, tobacco, and the islanders could sell their wares like their tweed and birds' eggs. Funnily enough, the tourists didn't want to eat the eggs, but they bought them like a novelty. They thought they were funny or silly souvenirs, which probably made the islanders feel even more primitive and stupid in comparison. This contact with outsiders brought over another threat, which was even more disease. The islanders didn't have immunity to these outside world diseases, and outbreaks turned out to be one of the biggest problems. Because of tourism, the islanders also started to learn much more about the world beyond their islands, which made some of them wonder naturally about maybe a better life elsewhere. Despite all the disease, they also had no hospitals or medics on the islands. The landowners who owned the islands, the MacLeods, paid to send a few nurses over to them through the years. However, a lot of nurses were not very happy about this. One of them asked to be moved off the islands and said that she'd given up hope of satisfying the islanders due to their peculiar customs and prejudices. I suppose they thought the islanders were really dirty people. Another nurse wrote in September 1914, "A winter here is quite long enough for any trained nurse. There is so much wet weather and no roads that life here is imprisonment for any who has led an active life. I've only had fresh meat once this year. I've had no butter for weeks, nor any fat of any kind. I had no potatoes and had to live on scones. Now I cannot even have scones regularly. I have no milk." Remember everyone's favourite preacher, Jon Mackay, from before? In his time, he actually stopped midwives from coming to the islands to help deliver babies safely. And that was actually a big cause of death back then. So then 1914 came around and World War I started, and at this point the island had a signal station built on it. They even got shelled by a German submarine once, though nobody was killed, luckily. Around this time, the island life basically just started to fall apart. The islanders were becoming increasingly dependent on a money-based economy and on the outside world in general. In some ways, money made life easier. They could hunt fewer seabirds and could instead import their food and goods, but this also brought them a new problem. Their survival now depended on outside supplies that they couldn't always guarantee. Over time, the island suffered a bunch of tragedies that were kind of the final nail in the coffin for the islanders. A lot of younger men simply left the island for the mainland to find work and live what they thought was a better life. A flu outbreak killed 4 working men, a bunch of crops failed in the 1920s, and without men to go and fetch food from the dangerous sea stacks and high cliffs, they relying on the outside world for precarious imports, always endlessly battling against disease and tourists coming over who think of you as primitive hunter-gatherer people. I mean, given all of this, it's not hard to see why the islanders began thinking about making a very serious decision about their future. The final turning point was a young woman dying of appendicitis in January 1930. Without proper medical care on the island, no one could save her, unfortunately. On the 10th of May 1930, 20 of the remaining native St Kildans wrote a letter to William Adamson, who was Scotland's Secretary of State at Westminster. "Sir, we, the undersigned natives of St Kilda, hereby respectfully pray and petition HM Government to assist us and to leave the island this year and to find homes and occupation for us on the mainland. For some years, the manpower has been decreasing. Now the total population of the island is reduced to 36. Several men out of this number have definitely made up our minds to go away this year to such employment on the mainland. This will really cause a crisis as the present number are hardly sufficient to carry on the necessary work of the place. These men are the mainstay of the island at present, as they tend the sheep, do the weaving and look after the general welfare of the widows. Should they leave, the conditions of the rest of the community will be such that it will be impossible for us to remain on the island another winter. The reason why assistance is necessary is that for many years St Kilda has not been self-supporting, and with facilities to better our position, we are therefore without the means to pay for the costs of removing ourselves and the furniture elsewhere. We do not ask to be settled together as a separate community, but in the meantime, we would collectively be very grateful of assistance and transference elsewhere where there would be a better opportunity of securing our livelihood." The decision to leave wasn't taken lightly. For many islanders, St Kilda was the only life they had ever known. The final island nurse, Wilhelmina Barclay, wrote in July 1930, "Every day makes me more sure that leaving the island is a step in the right direction. One problem solved itself this morning. The girl whom you saw in number 14 died. This is only another instance of the difficulties of St Kilda. Her end was so distressing, and I had to fight the battle single-handed. I'm looking forward to seeing the people happily settled on the mainland." On the 29th of August 1930, the final 36 St Kildans boarded the ship HMS Harebell and left Hirta, many for the final time. They hoped for better lives in places like Morven, Oban, Inverness, Portree and Stromford. Some of them were really excited about the idea of new adventures, but for others, it was a really sad day. One of the islanders wrote about it really beautifully in his book. "The morning of the evacuation promised a perfect day. The sun rose out of a calm and sparkling sea and warmed the impassive cliffs of Oysterval. The sky was hopelessly blue and the sight of Hirta, green and pleasant as the island of so many careless dreams, made parting all the more difficult. Observing tradition, the islanders left an open Bible and a small pile of oats in each house, locked all the doors, and at 7 a.m. boarded the Harebell. Although exhausted by the strain and hard work of the last few days, they were reported to have stayed cheerful throughout the operation. But as the long antler of Doon fell back onto the horizon and the familiar outline of the island grew faint, the severing of an ancient tie became a reality, and the St Kildans gave way to tears. After the evacuation, the islands went into a completely new phase of their history. By this point, there were no islanders there anymore to pay rent to the MacLeod clan, and upkeep would be really expensive for them. Luckily, there was a Scottish aristocrat, John Crichton Stewart, or Lord Dumfries as he was known, bought them. He was a massive bird enthusiast, so he bought them to keep them as kind of a bird sanctuary. When he died, he left them to the National Trust for Scotland, which is exactly why they're still protected and open to the public today. For the next 26 years, no one went to the islands apart from a few summers where some of the families that left went to visit them. In World War II, there were some aeroplane and boat crashes there. Meanwhile, the islanders settled in different parts of Scotland, unfortunately broken up into different areas. They apparently found it quite hard to adapt since they'd lived in a completely different community and lifestyle. They didn't speak much English either. You can read about their experiences from one of the last inhabitants in the Guardian newspaper article in the source list. In 1957, the islands were inhabited again, but this time by the British military. They paid and still pay National Trust for Scotland to use Hirta. They even built a pub on the islands, the Puff Inn, though it was closed in 2019. Today it's much easier to get to and from the island with modern boats and helicopters. There's even a helipad on Hirta, so they're owned and upkept by the National Trust for Scotland. The Soay sheep that I mentioned earlier are being studied by evolutionary biologists because they're a really primitive breed. They also study the Borere sheep on Borere, which is one of the rarest sheep breeds in the UK. Before we finish, here are a few other interesting things about St Kilda that didn't make the main script. The islanders had their own dialect of Scottish Gaelic, which was well studied. If you're curious about what life is like on the islands today, the current ranger, Sue, writes a blog for the National Trust of Scotland, which you can read. The islands also have some more native wildlife as well as the sheep that I mentioned, including field mice and wrens. There was once a species of house mouse there, but it's now gone extinct because the islanders left and there's no food or shelter for them. The islands even had their own variety of dandelion, which may have originally been brought there by the Vikings. There's a silent documentary from 1928 called St Kilda, Britain's Loneliest Isle, and it shows St Kilda men hunting fulmars on the cliffs. Interestingly, the film was funded by a guy called Jon McCallum, or his company Jon McCallum & Co., which was the steamship company running a route between Glasgow and St Kilda, most likely as a way to boost tourism and profits. There was another film inspired by the islands, which is called The Edge of the World. It tells the evacuation story, but it wasn't actually filmed on St Kilda because it was a hassle, so they filmed it on Fowler in the Shetland Islands because they look similar. Nobody's really sure where the name St Kilda comes from. The islanders themselves didn't really have a name in their language for the whole archipelago, but they usually talked about the individual islands instead. Some historians think basically that it comes from the Norse word skildir, which means shields, because the shields kind of resemble shields, I suppose, when seen from the sea. But there are many other theories and the true name origin isn't really known. There isn't any historical figure called St Kilda, and the name only really started appearing that way in around the 16th century when map makers started to label the islands in that way. There's a suburb in Melbourne, Australia called St Kilda. It was named in 1842 by a guy called Charles La Trobe after a schooner called the Lady of St Kilda was anchored there. That same schooner shipwrecked off Tahiti the following year. The boat was originally for carrying fruit from the Mediterranean to London, and then it was bought by a guy called Sir Thomas Dyke Ackland. He named it after his wife Lydia, who had visited the St Kilda Islands in 1812. and that's how it's got its name. At one point in the mid-1800s, lots of the islanders migrated to Australia, though there was quite a lot of tragedy at this point. A lot of them died of typhus or typhoid on the ships. One particularly interesting guy was Ewan Gillies, and he travelled a lot. He emigrated to Australia, New Zealand, and even California. He came back to the island several times after having tons of problems with his marriages and his kids. And apparently he tried to convince the other islanders to migrate with him as well, because he was really annoyed with how much rent they were paying to the landowners. But eventually the other islanders grew really tired of him and basically told him to get lost and go away. His grave can be found in Downey District Cemetery in Los Angeles County. There are a few written accounts from the islanders themselves. One boy from St Kilda wrote about sheep shearing in the early 20th century in English, which wasn't his first language. We are very busy shearing the sheep just now. They are very difficult to catch. They run in places that we cannot catch them. We take with us dogs. You can also watch original footage of the 1930 evacuation and interviews with former islanders filmed in the 1970s. You can read about all these points a bit more if you like. I've linked all the sources in the description if you're interested. So yeah, that's the history of St Kilda. When I looked at these islands, I thought they were going to be a lot simpler than they really are, and the research took me a lot longer than I expected. But yeah, it's a really, really interesting, fascinating place with a really cool history, and there's so much to read and see about them. So if you're an island enthusiast or you like really weird places like me, don't forget to check the description for the links to the sources. And yeah, let's cover another place in the next video. See you later.